Hey, my name's Russ. Just want to touch on material deformation as a tool for fire forensics. This is video 6 in a series of videos that review the tools for fire investigation associated with NFPA 921. Um, Springs can be used to determine intensity of fire. This is a differential analysis. If you have two same springs, one spring's closer to a fire than the other spring, what you're going to see is changes in terms of the crystalline structure of the spring material. You'll likely also see a deformation or length change. This is an example of a shock absorber spring from a garage fire. The spring itself, as you noticed, it's shorter than what it would normally be. So originally it was under some compression, and the elevated temperature caused an annealing to occur that resulted in it losing that compressive force. And then when it retracted, when the temperature went down, you see that it deformed to a smaller size. There are different temperatures or different strengths, I should say, different strengths for different materials at different temperatures. And you can use that to your advantage in performing an analysis. For instance, mentioned before in one of my other videos that steel will typically deform at over 500 degrees Celsius. Structural engineers typically use 550 degrees Celsius as a threshold for which structural steel no longer can be relied on for strength. So this chart basically shows you the threshold for various strengths. You can do some calculations to determine what the force is on it, and then identify how much deformation occurred, and that is one way to determine what the temperature of that material was. So there's some steps for analyzing furniture springs. It's important that you understand this is a differential type analysis. One single spring is not necessarily going to give you much information. But if you have multiple springs on a couch, you can compare those springs in different areas of that piece of furniture. But to do that, you have to determine a few things. So deformation is going to be a function not just only of heat, but also of applied load, or what force is acting upon that spring. So if you have locations where a spring is undergoing more force than other locations, you'll have consequential differences in the length after the fire. And the other thing to consider is that deformation is going to be a function of heat transfer into the spring itself. And heat transfer can be blocked by shields, by insulation, by things like pillows and blankets, by couch cushions. So that's going to affect the overall deformation. And reconstructing a scene, for instance, was there a box on top of that sofa that may have blocked energy penetration at a certain location, but then that box ignited and the ash went away? There are some factors here that need to be scrutinized in using this tool. So there's some additional things to consider. Some couches are going to use different materials, different spring thicknesses or sizes at different locations. Consider a backrest versus a seat cushion. Consider some of the materials that might be in an armrest or in some kind of a recliner. Does age impact condition of springs? Cold working does affect steel. In fact, cold worked or cold thread rolling, for instance, produces a stronger thread on a screw or a bolt. Give that as an example. So what you have, if you have an old sofa where a particular set of springs was routinely cycled, that's going likely to have different strength properties than a spring at a location that simply was not cycled on that same piece of furniture. Another factor to consider is the heat transfer associated with ventilation. So in post flashover conditions, you might well have several bed springs. Some of those might be close to an open window or a cracked window or a door or something like that. What that's going to result in is more heat flux at the location where you have more oxygen than in other locations lacking that same oxygen content. Another thing to consider is because deformation is a function of heat transfer, and heat transfer is it's dependent on distance away from an energy source. You could have one portion of a couch closer to an energy source than another. And that's one of the principal uses for this analytical tool. is to determine, is basically point to a location where hotter fire could have occurred. So that's how you're going to use this. So it should be obvious that a couch where some springs are away from a fire will have less deformation than springs in the same couch closer to a fire. One really important myth, this is a topic that has widely been used in decades past, resulting in convictions where the prosecutors, fire forensic experts, the firefighters involved in arson investigation, they claim that springs, furniture springs with deformation, are due to ignitable liquids, and that's just patently false. There may be a time, 70 years ago when you could make that argument, maybe, very loosely. What you'll observe if you look at the combustion temperatures of hydrocarbons versus cellulose, honestly, it's about the same. I mean, there's some subtle differences. Length of temperature may be a factor, but using the notion that because gasoline was on a sofa, and that's what, that's the conclusion, and it caused spring deformation, you cannot make that call. Now, what you can do is do some sampling on the debris left over and have a laboratory analysis conclude that there are some hydrocarbons, some gasoline remnants. That's feasible. But drawing the conclusion from deformed springs that an ignitable liquid was used, there's no scientific value in that. That's one of those classic myths. So in conclusion, material deformation is a valuable tool in understanding energy transfer differences between locations. It allows you to narrow down, in other words, using the tools of spring compaction, for instance, what the length of a spring is, two same springs that have different overall lengths after the fire. The spring with higher deformation with the same load configuration throughout the fire, that's going to be closer to the fire. So that's the kind of use for this kind of a tool you would have in fire forensics. Hey, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.